So for the first part of this demo today, I'm catching up on the polyacrylic transfers that we're applying to this particular substrate here. Now I'm speeding this up 3.5 times, so it's not quite real time. This particular layer of paper removal here, I think probably took 20 minutes or so, so significantly less here in terms of the clip size. But a good amount of paper came off here, but then also some of the graphic came off too. And I think this textural aspect of this particular method is just what I have kind of come to expect. Now, I feel like I've applied enough layers to this piece to have given myself the chance to use different amounts of water, different rubbing techniques, varying amounts of pressure that I'm applying to the graphic as I'm rubbing off the paper, and also how many layers of removal are necessary before kind of recoating with the polyacrylic again and making it look a bit more saturated and wet again. So to my conclusion, I will say that there really isn't a best practice or a best method, I would say. In my regard, based on the prints that I was using and the paper that I was using, removing the paper in 2 to 3 layers seems to be giving me the best results with the least amount of ink removal. However, I would not say that that is the only way of doing this. I would say there are definitely exceptions, or depending on what kind of textural quality you want the graphic to appear as. And so here you can see I'm just kind of working my way around the surface. I end up rinsing off the surface here and putting it out to dry. Here I'm prepping graphics for the next layer. So you can see that the substrate is dry underneath. I recoated the whole surface again with the polyacrylic. And I've found a graphic online of this barbed wire fence. It wasn't quite long enough to fit the width of the substrate. So I had to print it off into 2 papers. And here you can see I'm just taping this together as a means of just kind of bridging these papers together, so that when I lay them down, they will actually adhere to the surface aligned to one another. And so here I'm actually taping these down so I can trim them out and cut them as tight as possible, so that when I do use them, I'm actually removing less paper than if it were the whole thing. And I can also rearrange the barbed wire to my liking. So you can see I start thinking about the composition, how to compose some of these graphics, and just think about how to generate some kind of spatial relationship. And I decided to take this wood texture and start cutting it into strips and realigning those in a slightly offset position. And I use a little slip of tape to hold them together as I lay them back down onto the composite, or sorry, the substrate, to generate some kind of extra level of imagery. And so at this point here, I'm just experimenting with the imagery, trying to think about how these various colors and textures are going to function with one another. And at this point in time, I'm honestly just trying to fill space and to layer up these textures in such a means where I can start making the overall composition attractive. So here I am coating the panel once again with polycrylic, and this will be my adhesive method for laying down the strips of paper off to the side, and then also the graphic at the top. I'm starting to wet the paper again for my second layer of graphics kind of going on to the substrate. And it seemed to me like getting off this paper here was somewhat of a delicate process. I wet the paper not quite as heavily as before, and the graphics seemed to remain on the surface fairly well. I also did put down a fairly heavy primer coat before laying down the initial paper. And so these seem to come out pretty good with just 2 layers of removal. So after this particular layer of paper removal, I had to rinse off the substrate, let it dry, and then go back at this one more time with paper removal. So this is 3.5 times in terms of its speed. So you can see I am kind of finessing the rubbing technique here for these various pieces, and you know they are coming off a little bit, right? You still get that same textural visual presentation based on the way that the image is removed. Once again, I'm laying down my elements here to think about my composition. And my intent, I think, was to lay down one layer of barbed wire, this star looking graphic at the top to start bringing in some more visual interest. And then I will precisely cut out these flowers at the bottom left corner and perhaps bring in a few more layers of barbed wire and also other graphics at the bottom. I really have no idea where this will continue to go, and so really at this point in time I'm still building the base layer of the piece. In this particular video here, I'm once again coating the surface with polyacrylic and intending to lay down my next layer of graphics. So you're going to see one layer of barbed wire. I later decide to wrap that around the edges, and then also the star graphic that I'll be putting in here shortly. I'm using a printmaking squeegee, a plastic printmaking squeegee, to make sure that the paper is held down as close as possible to the surface. I'm really trying to get some nice compression there between the paper surface and the polyacrylic. And so I will let this dry overnight before I go back at it tomorrow, removing the paper and continuing the piece. So we'll check in with this again next week and see about applying a second layer of media, perhaps in the form of the pork gelatin transfer, or something else. I really don't know what the plan is yet for this piece, and I think that's just okay. This is our demo piece for the polyacrylic technique. Hey guys, so we are going to talk about marbling tonight. Marbling really allows you to apply paint or ink to the surface of a paper using a hydro dipping method. So we're going to be using a bin full of water here. Just have a few inches worth of water in this flat bin, and we're going to be using this. This is tint for art resin. If you can get a good look at that there. And these tints happen to be metallics and pearls, so they will have somewhat of a metallic pearl particle that is included in with the tint. The cool thing about these specific tints is they are oil-based. And so what will happen is, as I apply the tints to the surface of the water here, the tints will remain on the surface of the water, and so I will dip an array of watercolor and drawing papers. We'll see how absorbent they are or how they take in the tints, and I'm going to hang those up to dry using a makeshift hanger I have over here out of fishing line. And we can use that as a ground. We can cut those up and use them as collage materials, or we can use those as artwork outright. I'm going to attempt to apply it to this white panel, possibly, and we'll see if this is going to work out. I'm going to probably have to do this a second time with a little bit more water in here in order to dip this full panel, and we'll use this as part of our gelatin transfer process next week, the pork gelatin transfer process. Okay. So as I start to drip in some of this ink, let me first talk about paper just briefly here. This is Arches. It's a watercolor paper that happens to be hot pressed. Hot pressed paper really just has a smooth finish. That's all it's referring to. A cold pressed paper would have some texture to it, so an Arches 88 would be a cold pressed paper. The other thing to note about Arches 88 is it happens to be a waterleaf paper, and waterleaf paper has no sizing to it. Sizing, or it's also known as internal sizing, it's a material that's added to most paper pulp to impart water resistance. So basically, water leaf papers have the ability to absorb water and other fluids readily and instantly. Um, I would also say that is very similar to the other Arch watercolor paper that I'm using here, the watercolor paper that you saw flash up on screen. That is the stuff that I'm finding to give me the best results. The Arch 88 is actually terrible for this process. And you will see that in, I think, the third section or example. Another thing to point out is I also use some black paper. Most of the ink that I'm using in this case, or tints, I should say, are metallic based. So they do have little tiny pieces of pigment that are floating around in the ink as it's being mixed up. And so you can see here that I'm maybe in the reflection of the water. I'm trying to shake the ink as much as I can to really move around those metallic particles and to even out the consistency as it's dripped out of the bottle. It took me a little while to actually figure out how to best apply the tint. Here I am just kind of filling in more spaces, and I use a little wooden dowel to kind of mix this up further. Now, I've also been told when it comes to marbling, I'm going to experience this by tomorrow morning. I'm going to leave all of the ink sitting on the top surface after I'm done working through this process. And I'll see how things settle on the surface of the water, and I'll run a couple more tomorrow morning and see what they look like. I've heard that the more interesting designs, as these tints and inks kind of work into one another on the surface of the water, that's when you get the kind of the coolest textural designs in terms of applying them to paper. So here I'm just using a few different colors, blue, green, silver, and also yellow. And I'm playing this back in real time here so that you can get a sense of just what this looks like or how they tend to mix in with one another. So as I start in with some of these dips, you'll see that I'm kind of rolling it into the surface of the water, and that's kind of hard to explain, but basically I'm rolling it in so that the ink kind of rolls onto the surface of the paper, dipping it underneath the surface, and then pulling it back out the same way. Letting it drip just a little bit. It will apply this to both sides, and the designs will be different because it's stretching that tint quite a bit differently, depending on what direction you're dragging that into the water. So here you can see that the tint is broken up a little bit more, but there's also tons of green. So I'm also shifting the paper back and forth to see if I can manipulate it just a little bit more with kind of these diagonal streaks. So you can see that's accentuated on the left-hand side. So this is the Arches 88, the water leaf paper, and you can see how much it soaks up the water, but it does not become very receptive to the tint or the oil on the surface. And my assumption is just because the water is so absorbent, it struggles to maintain a surface for the tint to rest on, and so it's really just soaking all that moisture up into the paper, and it tends to kind of bleed or blend all of those colors together, or even just prevent them from even sticking at all. So one side it came out not too bad, the other side was almost blank. And here's the first black paper print, and I thought this was really cool. Definitely cooler in person to see the metallic surface and the sheen after it comes out of the water. You probably can't tell quite as much as what it was inside the water. But I overall thought this was a really cool appearance, especially the backside here. One thing I did notice about the black paper is the dye used to make the paper. Once it was wet, it started dripping off the corner there and back down into the water. I added some gold and bronze. Now, these colors are going to start getting muddy as I continue adding the colors and various tints to the surface, but I thought I would give it a go and see what this was like. So once again, a lot of green, but trying to bring some of those kind of earth tones back into the surface and kind of moving it back and forth to give those wavy effects. Here I added some red, and I didn't mix it up. I just kind of went straight in with it. Still a lot of green in the mix, but the red was able to kind of maintain its own form and shape, unless it was manipulated. So by this point, I just wanted to get a bunch of purple in there and see what happens. I mix this up with the dowel rod, as you'll see, to try to break it up and make for more organic shapes and forms. And I am wearing a glove, as you might notice there. I'm trying to keep this oily tint off of my fingers. I thought that was a really cool one too. Instant gratification. On this one, I tried just going very, very slow, really trying to allow the water to just kind of soak itself in very slowly and kind of pull the tint to the surface of the paper. So a little bit of green, a little bit of purple with this one here, but I felt like that specific technique really worked out well. And here I'm just kind of moving the tint away from the surface of the water so I could bring that back out without a bunch of extra tint finding itself onto the surface of the paper. So I feel like that was the technique definitely to use as I was starting to run out a little bit more of the tint. Now, this next clip here, I almost kicked myself after I had done it. I got a little anxious. I wanted to see what it would do, and came to realize that I didn't quite have enough water in my my tub here to really give me the result that I was hoping for. So you can see it just kind of pushes away funny on the one side, even though the ground that is on the panel itself accepted the ink just fine.